This is a Sports Radio Live podcast covering your world of sports. Bryan Houston's Sports Radio Live. It's weekdays at 3 on 99.3 Talk FM, the talk of East Texas.
So anyway, all right, so we're talking about the Bears, and just so happens that we're also going to be talking about the Bears with our next guest, because now on the APEC VIP hotline, cutting-edge training for the serious athlete, apecgo.com. Joining us now from Sports Illustrated, the author of Sweetness, The Enigmatic Life of Walter Payton, Jeff Perlman. Jeff, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Sure, my pleasure.
Really glad to have you here. Why did you write the book?
Well, I grew up sort of in the 80s, a child of the 80s, and had always loved Walter Payton as a kid. Had him on my wall, and, when I write books for a living, and when you start thinking about what iconic people are there out there who haven't been sort of portrayed in a definitive biography, and you go down the list, it's increasingly hard to find people. I mean, over the last few years, Willie Mays, Lou Gehrig, Sandy Koufax, Mickey Mantle, Jackie Robinson, have been sort of tabbed, and you want to do original work, and you want to find someone different and unique. And here's Walter Payton, iconic, larger than life, but also kind of mysterious, and not as well known as someone would think. So when I started looking into him, I thought, wow, this is really would be a very interesting guy to write about, and he was.
So the Sports Illustrated excerpt, I read that, and it focused a lot on his extramarital affair during the time of the Hall of Fame induction, and it didn't paint a very flattering picture of Payton at that time. And then it also dealt with kind of the sadness of what life is like after you've been the greatest running back in the history of pro football. All of that, was that basically what the theme of this book is? Or
No. This is a definitive biography of his life. That was a sliver of a chapter. I mean, look, he had a tremendous fall, like a lot of professional athletes do. I mean, you guys are in Tyler, right?
Yes.
I mean, every time I see Earl Campbell, I think, and I once read an interview with Earl Campbell where he said he wouldn't trade it a minute for his career, and I always think, wow, really?
He can barely walk.
I would, because I know if I were in his shoes, I don't know if I could say the same thing. But this is what athletes go through. I mean, it's brutal, especially football players, physically, mentally, emotionally. And so that chapter that was excerpted really talked a lot about it. But the book is really a sort of narrative of a fascinating life of a guy who grew up in segregated Columbia, Mississippi, who was part of the school desegregation effort, who went out to Jackson State and fought to get recognition when everyone was talking about Archie Griffin at Ohio State and Anthony Davis at USC. And he, gets drafted by the Bears, and it's the last place he wants to go. I mean, he cries. He's in his dorm room at Jackson State crying when he gets drafted.
Really?
He wanted to go to the Houston Oilers. That was his first choice, and his best friend at the time was Robert Brazile, the linebacker.
Okay.
And Brazile was his roommate at Jackson State and his senior year. And Brazile gets drafted by the Oilers, and they're in the same room together, and he's happy as a freaking clam. And Walter Payton is crying because he's going to Chicago, to this horrible organization where it's always 6 degrees outside. So it's really this whole sort of narrative of a guy's life. And then, again, after he retired, sort of the depression he went through and the difficulties before he was diagnosed with this, ultimately life-ending illness.
So I based on some of the things I've read, I take it that you're not well received in Chicago these days.
Well, I haven't been there yet, but I would say
maybe you ought to not go.
If I had someone picking me up at the airport, I might advise them not to hold my name up on a sign. I don't know. It's sort of disappointing because the book really is a definitive biography of his life, not just one chapter. But people read the one chapter, and I think sort of like you, assume that it's the whole book is this sort of the downfall of Walter Payton. And to me, he was an amazing man, and he went through a lot of difficult things. Not everything he did you would be proud of, but he also he had an incredible heart and incredible compassion, and really understood the role of a superstar, and that you could make people's days, that 2 seconds of time, that a minute, a wave, a handshake, a hug, could someone would remember that forever. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing.
So even with the flaws that you wrote about with Walter Payton, you still come away sounding like you still have this great fondness for him.
I have more fondness for him now than I did before the book, because I really think when you talk about someone's sort of difficulties and setbacks and faults, and then you learn about how they handle them and sort of what caused them and what in their life led up to these points, I think you can't help but sort of have more admiration. It's sort of like I bet if I spent a few days with George Clooney and heard him like Bert and fart and do crazy things and tell off-color jokes, I'd like him a lot more than I do just knowing him as sort of the superstar in the tuxedo. There's something about humanizing our heroes that makes them more likable, not less.
Sure. So what were some things that you did? And I understand you worked on this book for 2 or 3 years. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about 3 years and almost 700 interviews.
700 interviews?
Yeah.
Man, so what kind of things did you learn about Walter Payton that you had no idea about before you started doing the interviews and doing all this research?
Well, two of my definite favorites were, number one, when he died, he was eulogized at his funeral for his 45 amazing years of life. And he lived 45 years, and the Tribune, the Sun-Times, all the Chicago papers, the New York Times, Walter Payton 45. And it turns out he was actually 46. That when he was at Jackson State entering his senior year, he desperately wanted to be a Heisman Trophy candidate. And he knew he was at a disadvantage playing for a SWAC school, a small black school in the 1970s. And he thought if he made himself a year younger, it would add to his resume. So he changed his age while he was a senior at Jackson State and never bothered changing it back. So his whole life, everyone thought he was a year younger than he was. And it's funny, I was on a TV show with Emory Moorhead, the former Bear tight end, the other day, and I said that. And he goes, "That sounds like Walter." And the other thing I love is, his nickname is famous. Sweetness, Sweetness, Sweetness. Everyone knows Sweetness. But nobody seemed to know how he got the nickname. And after his senior year at Jackson State, before he played as a rookie in the NFL, he played an all-star exhibition game. They had a bunch of college all-stars play the defending champion, the Pittsburgh Steelers, in a game at Northwestern. And while they were practicing for this series, Payton one day takes a handoff into practice, and he's about to be he's approached by a safety, and he just screams out, "Your sweetness is your weakness," and runs past him. And everyone's like, "What the hell did Walter Payton just say?" And they're all cracking up laughing, at this thing. And Payton the next day shows up and writes "sweetness" across the blackboard. And that's the birth of Sweetness.
Wow.
That's how he got his nickname. It had nothing to do with like sweet moves or sweet guy. That is exactly, your sweetness is your weakness.
Now, I read somewhere that the family was not real happy with it, didn't cooperate with you on this. Is that true?
No, that's not true. They did cooperate. I sat down with both kids. I sat down with his brother at length. I think, to be totally honest, that they're probably not in love with some of the stuff in the book. Mm-hmm. As I told them at the time, and as I've told everyone, it was going to be a definitive biography, not merely a sort of love note to Walter Payton, but I wanted to write his true life story. So, I haven't talked to him since the book came out. They issued a statement that I thought was fair, basically sort of saying, Walter was a human being with faults and, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't really know. But I sat down with his kids at length for the book, sat down with his brother at length for the book. So I definitely had some cooperation.
Well, and you talked obviously to a lot of his teammates, I guess.
Oh yeah, I did, and I always think the key to I have this philosophy when I write books, and I developed it early on. And I think it's very important. Is I don't just call like Jim McMahon and Willie Gault. I think you have to talk to everyone. And my philosophy is I would go through the Bears media guides one by one from every year he played in Chicago, and
that's a lot of bad football players,
Say that again?
I said that's a lot of bad football players.
Oh, yeah, a lot of them. But I wouldn't just call the guys on the roster. I would call the guys who were drafted, the guys who were in camp for a week, even for a day. And I'd tell them I'm doing this book. Because, all right, so Walter Payton might not remember the 8th-round pick from Delaware who lasted for 3 weeks. But the 8th-round pick from Delaware who lasted for 3 weeks is always going to remember something about his time in camp with Walter Payton.
Wow. So was he well-liked by all of his teammates? Was he somebody who was very popular on the team? Or?
Yeah, he was, but he was confusing. He was subtitle of the book is Enigmatic Life, and he was very enigmatic. He was goofy, sort of weird, oddball sense of humor. Was a guy who would he liked sneaking up behind people during training camp and pulling the hair out of their legs, and they would think it's like they're being stung by a bee. He was very off color. He could be. Some guys found him sexually intimidating. He would make inappropriate comments. Pinch your butt and run away. And guys would be like, what is Walter doing? He was not the easy read. He was not an easy read. And he also happened to be very guarded. For a guy who came off as very aloof, he actually was very guarded and very he would let you in, but he wouldn't let you fully in.
Okay. Did you ever actually meet Walter Payton?
I did actually meet Walter Payton. It was 1999. I was 26, and I was a sort of a new writer at Sports Illustrated. And, he had just announced that he was sick, and so I was flown out to meet with him at his office. And when I got there, I was greeted by a man who was an elderly man, I guess, working there. And I introduced myself, and he said, "Hi, I'm Walter Payton."
Wow.
And he had, his eyes were yellow from jaundice. His skin was, not what it used to be, and he just was like this sort of frail shadow of what he once was.
So you didn't even know it was Walter Payton?
Didn't even recognize him.
That's incredible. Now, based on the book, and did you consider the timing of this? Was did you think that, okay, is this book going to sell? Does that ever come through your mind when you're writing about? I mean, obviously you're doing it for a living, so you're wondering, are people still even that interested in Walter Payton all these years after his death? And it's been such a long time since he's played. What was the thought process there?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't been asked that yet. Yeah, you do think that. You certainly do, and I have sort of wondered that throughout this process. Do people still care about Walter Payton? There's a generation of sports fans now who never even saw him play. Fans in their 20s wouldn't have seen him. But then I got to say, I went to Chicago a couple years ago and went to a Bears game at the beginning of this book, and it was the Bears Cardinals. Had nothing to do with Walter Payton whatsoever. And I'm going to the game, and there are hundreds of people still wearing Walter Payton jerseys at Soldier Field. And Mike Ditka later told me something that I thought was very interesting. He said, you go to a Cleveland Brown game, you don't see anyone wearing Jim Brown jerseys. You go to a Green Bay Packer fan game, no one's wearing Paul Hornung jerseys. I'm sure if you go to a Houston Texans game, there's not that many Earl Campbell jerseys walking around the stadium.
No.
Soldier Field, Walter Payton jerseys are everywhere. And
wow.
I think because of the way he treated fans and the way fans identified with him.
That's incredible now. Okay, so have you already picked your next topic?
I haven't, actually. I'm struggling for that right now. But I don't know yet. I wish I did.
I just was talking to the guys here in the studio. We were talking about this book and what kind of reception you might get in Chicago, because I would suspect it would be very similar to writing a book about the dark side, if there is such a thing, the dark side of Roger Staubach or Tom Landry. Yeah. If you could actually find one, I mean, it's interesting because the truth of the matter is, and you just said something that I think is really telling here, is everybody has their flaws. Everyone has their moments. We've all done things that we're not proud of, and we've all had dark times in our life, universally, across the board. And I think the more we sort of raise people on pedestals, untouchable pedestals, it's almost like the more damage we do to their reputations, because inevitably someone's going to let you down if you put them at this height. Mm-hmm. And nothing's wrong with knowing that Tom Landry had this issue, or Earl Campbell had this issue, or someone went through this. It's sort of what makes us human, and I'm never a fan of idolization of stars. Justin Bieber, that kid has zits. I have bad news for all the girls out there. The kid has zits. It's a guarantee. We all. It's just reality, and there's nothing wrong with knowing that the people we worship are human beings. Sure. Well, it's fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the entire book, and I was very interested in reading the excerpt, and then after that, hearing what you had to say about it, because again, I wondered, because you talk about how you felt about him. I wondered before you talked about how much you still idolize him now, that if you were disappointed by what you found out about him, and if in finding out those disappointing things that made you step back and think, maybe I ought to not write this stuff.
No, because number one, when you're writing a definitive biography, the goal is to find out who a human being is, and it's not. My first book was about the '86 Mets, and I grew up with that team here in New York. I mean, that was my team, but when you sort of step into the writer's mode, and you're not the fan anymore, you become just curious and inquisitive, and you're fascinated, and you're not a protector. You're not a destroyer, and you're not a protector. You're just trying to write a true, accurate, honest, fair portrayal of someone's life, and that's sort of where I was with this.
Outstanding. Well, Jeff Perlman writes for Sports Illustrated. The name of the book is Sweetness, The Enigmatic Life of Walter Payton. Your website is jeffperlman.com, and I guess that gives you all the information about some of the background behind the book as well, right?
Yep, that's correct. I tried to put a lot up there.
We really do appreciate you taking time for us here in Tyler, Texas, to talk about the book. I was fascinated by it, and fascinated by probably what you're going through right now after writing the book, and so it was very, very much appreciated that you came on the show today.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Jeff Perlman from Sports Illustrated. Thank you, sir. All right.
This is a Sports Radio Live podcast covering your world of sports. Bryan Houston's Sports Radio Live. It's weekdays at 3 on 99.3 Talk FM, the talk of East Texas.